Hello and welcome to the Virtual Lubar Center and On the Issues program here at Marquette Law School. I'm Alan Borsuk. I'm a senior fellow here. We are going to be talking today about our new poll on issues related to the United States Supreme Court. I want to especially welcome Professor Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette Poll, who will guide us through these new results. So Charles, let's start with a little background on what we're doing with the poll and the specifics of this poll.
Yeah, this is for our national survey, which we do every other month on the U.S. Supreme Court and other national issues. This survey was done March 14th through the 24th, and we interviewed 1,004 adults nationwide, and there's a margin of error of plus or minus 4 percentage points. With these national surveys, we interview a sample that is selected through address-based sampling. That is to say, we give every postal address in the country a known chance of being selected into the sample. And then we conduct the interviews on the internet using web-based interviewing. But it's a random sample, not a volunteer sample or a convenience-based sample, as some web surveys still are.
So I have some impression, being a living human being, that the United States Supreme Court has been in the news a lot lately. And let's start with the number one reason, which is the nomination of Appeals Court Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. What did we find on popular opinion nationwide? I want to emphasize that again in regard to her nomination.
Well, as she's now finished with the committee hearings and awaiting a vote in the Senate, Ketanji Brown Jackson has strong support in our survey. 66% support the nomination, 34% are opposed to the nomination. That's solid support. Also, 46% think she's very qualified, 42% somewhat qualified, just 12% say she's not qualified. And so she starts off in the hearings and now moving ahead to a Senate vote with quite strong public support.
But not across the board, I bet.
No, there is a party split, as there is with everything in politics these days. Maybe the surprising part is she gets 29% support among Republicans, though 71% are opposed. But in these partisan times, 29%'s not bad. But more importantly, she gets an overwhelming 67% of support among independents, the folks that, aren't programmed to either support or oppose her. And then finally, nearly universal support among Democrats, 95% support there. So it's a strong showing overall with that 2/3 favoring her nomination. But I think getting 29% among Republicans is not a bad showing, given the partisanship that we have these days.
The polling window we used was split both before and during the nomination hearings last week. What effect did the hearings have?
Yeah, that's right. This wasn't through any plan, but it just happened to be that the hearings fell towards the end of our survey period. As a result, we had completed 837 interviews before the hearings, but we still got 167 interviews after the hearings were over. The differences were pretty small, but they may be notable. Support for her nomination was at 64% before the hearings, but 72% once the hearings began. And the view of her qualifications also went up. 44% viewed her as very qualified before the hearings, 52% very qualified as the hearings were underway or finished.
She is the first Black woman nominated to the Supreme Court, which makes it interesting to ask, is there, what's the picture of support for her broken down by racial identification?
Yeah, I think the demographics of this are not surprising, but they're, again, fairly striking and show strong support across the board. Among Black respondents, 86% support her nomination. Hispanic respondents, 76%. Those of other races or multiple races, 71%. And among white respondents, 59% support the nomination. So solid majorities across the board, but stronger support in the Black and Hispanic and other racial communities.
She would be, now I don't remember the number, the 6th or 7th woman to be nominated or to be seated on the Supreme Court. What's the breakdown by gender on feelings about her qualifications?
Women are also a bit more supportive. 69% of women support the nomination, 61% of men. These are, just modest differences, but they are differences that show that her appeal is pretty strong across the board, but it's especially strong with racial minorities or with women.
And the support or lack of support for her in terms of ideological orientation?
As the Supreme Court has become more and more a centerpiece of political debate, it's hardly a surprise that ideology plays a big role in it. When we look at how people describe themselves in ideological terms, among those who say they are very conservative, 27% support her nomination, 72% are opposed. But among those who are somewhat conservative, it's close to an even split. 45 support, 54 opposed. And we get to moderates, which is still a large chunk of the American electorate. Fully 69% support, 30% opposed. And among liberals of either somewhat liberal or very liberal, support's over 90%. So there's a pretty noticeable gradient across ideology. But again, getting close to a third of support even among very conservative voters, and then breaking even among the somewhat conservative, again, I think is a good example of her support.
You did an interesting experiment, shall we call it, related to identifying Ketanji Brown Jackson by race. Talk about it.
Yeah, obviously we've just seen the results. We just talked about them, about how people of different races or genders view her. But we wanted to see whether emphasizing in some way her race and gender would make any difference to how people saw her. And so we embedded a subtle experiment in the survey. In an early question that we asked about whether people were paying attention, we either described her as nominated to be the first Black woman on the Supreme Court, or we described her as nominated to replace Justice Stephen Breyer on the Supreme Court. So the first mentions race and gender, the other does not. This was done in a way so that a random half of the sample saw race and gender mentioned in a description that otherwise was asking about how much attention you were paying. And what we found was there were modest effects that fell a little short of statistical significance, but in fact, boosted her support when race and gender were mentioned. When those were not mentioned, 62% supported her nomination, but when race and gender were mentioned, 69% supported. There was less effect on views of whether she was qualified or not. When race and gender were mentioned, there was a 2% increase in very qualified from 45 to 47, really a pretty minimal change. Though the percent saying she was not qualified actually went down from 14% to 9%. So I think what we see here is that because the results are not statistically significant, we can't say with certainty that race and gender was an asset to her, but we certainly can say that there's no evidence at all that race and gender hurt her at all. And the evidence is reasonably strong that it probably helps her a bit.
We've asked in polls about the Supreme Court about favorability and unfavorability towards individual justices and what percentage of people can even give an opinion about them. We asked this time about Ketanji Brown Jackson. What was the outcome?
Yeah, Supreme Court justices are awfully important officials of our government, but they're not exactly in the news every day, and relatively few of us get up and think about the courts day in and day out. So we need to put this in the context of the justices as a whole are not terribly well known. On the other hand, at the time of the nomination is probably when a justice is best known because they're in the news, they're subject to the debate over confirmation and so on. That's certainly true with Judge Jackson. 62% were able to give a favorable or unfavorable rating of her. That would be low for a presidential candidate, but it's high for a justice. The second best known justice from our January survey of the court was Clarence Thomas at 55%. And the least known justice is actually the Justice Jackson would replace, Stephen Breyer, where only 21% were able to give a rating for him in January. Beyond that, and in keeping with the strong support for her confirmation, Jackson has a good favorability rating, 44% favorable, 18% unfavorable, for a net favorability of plus 26 points. That's also the highest of the sitting justices. The highest now behind Jackson is Sonia Sotomayor at 20 points net favorable. So again, a lot of this is because as a nominee, she's in the spotlight and people are paying attention to the nomination and to her. But it does show that she is in a strong position, both in support for confirmation, but also in positive views of her on favorability and an unusually high visibility among the public for sitting justices.
Since we started polling on the Supreme Court in 2019, we've asked several times about what people thought of qualifications for getting a positive vote in the US Senate. If a nominee is otherwise qualified and has no ethical problems, is it in bounds for a senator to oppose a nominee on the basis of how they think the nominee would vote on particular cases, or by party identification? We asked that this time. Let's start with the question of issue orientation.
The background of these questions come from a now long ago time in the 70s, 80s, 90s, when justices for the court were routinely confirmed by a 90-something to nothing or 90-something to 2 or 3 no votes. And at that time, you would often hear members of the opposing party, opposing the president's party, say, I have reservations about this person, but their qualifications are clear and, we should give the president their nominee. Obviously, that sentiment has changed dramatically in the 2000s and the 2010s and now in the 2020s. And so this is not nearly the consensual view that well-qualified and no ethical problems was reason enough to vote for someone. So we first ask, is a senator justified in voting against simply because of how they believe the judge or justice would decide cases on issues such as abortion, gun rights, affirmative action, policy issues? Here, overall, we see that 40% say that a senator is justified in voting against on those policy grounds. But 59% say that that's not a good enough reason to vote against a qualified and not ethically challenged nominee. So that's a lot higher probably that would support voting against than if we had asked this question in the 1990s or 80s. But it still shows a majority think even policy disagreements are not a reason to vote against a well-qualified candidate.
Let's go ahead.
On party grounds.
Yeah,
Then
just going to
we
say
ask
that.
a second question. Would you be justified in voting against a qualified nominee simply because they're from a different political party, or the president is of a different political party than the senator is? Here, even fewer people say that's justified. 17% say that's a reason enough to vote against a qualified nominee. 82% disagree with that. Now, again, here we see the reality of modern partisanship is that we consider it notable when a nominee gets 2, 3, 4 votes from the other party, let alone wins the vast majority of the other party's support. But in terms of public sentiment, I think from both of these questions, you can still see that there's lots of support for the notion that well-qualified judges should be confirmed, but there's considerably more willingness to let policy disagreements be a justification for voting against them, but not party.
Has this changed as the party of the president has changed in the last couple of years?
Well, oddly enough, it has. There's a whole lot of whose ox is being gored in these circumstances. When President Trump was in office in 2020, in our survey, which was done before Justice Ginsburg died, so before there was a vacancy on the court at that time, and we asked the question about voting against on policy reasons. 39% of Republicans said that policy disagreement was a good enough reason to vote against. But now with a Democratic nominee, that goes up to 58%. So from a pretty solid minority to now a decent majority of Republicans. Democrats, again, not really surprisingly, have gone the other direction. When Trump was president, 47% of Democrats said policy disagreement was a good reason to vote against. And that has fallen to 29% among Democrats now. There's not as much change on voting against based on party alone. The one notable change is among Democrats. Democrats saying party's a good enough reason to vote no were 24% when Trump was in office. That falls by almost half to 13% now. So clearly the answers to these questions depend on whether it's a president of your party that may be making a nomination or whether it's a president of the other party. Though I suppose it's fair to say that even when the other party is in office, there still remains a pretty substantial sense that well-qualified candidates should have the benefit of the doubt on nominations.
How important to people are Supreme Court nominations? It's the least prominent of the three branches on a day-to-day basis.
Right. In here, we've seen some real change over time. In this survey in March now, 61% of Democrats say the appointment is very important to them. Just 44% of Republicans say that. But in 2019, again, without an appointment pending, 54% of Democrats said very important. 53% of Republicans did, about the same. I think what we've seen here is a ramping up of the perceived importance among Democrats, which is a little interesting because during the Trump administration, we often heard that appointment of judges was one of the most important policy goals for Republicans, for Republican Senate leadership and senators. And that was true at one point. Republicans did say that judicial appointments were more important than Democrats did. But as Democrats have seen 3 previous appointments to the court under President Trump, it's Democrats who've become more concerned and give more importance to court appointments. Republicans have slipped off a little bit in that importance.
One more question related to Judge Jackson. What's people's perception of the impact she'll have on the ideological balance of the court?
Right. So if she were confirmed, 13% say she would make the court much more liberal, 33% somewhat more liberal, 45% said they didn't think she would change the court much, and a small 6% think she'd make it more conservative, and 2% much more conservative. In this situation, with a 6-3 conservative majority on the court, and she's replacing one of the liberal justices, she won't change the party balance or the balance of people by presidential appointing party. She won't change that one way or another, though her views will certainly influence decisions and influence opinions that she writes and that others write. So on balance, what we see is not quite half, 45% saying she won't change it much. But of those who see a change, somewhat more liberal, 33, much more liberal, just 13. So a bit of a liberal shift, a perception of her.
In general, we've been keeping an eye in these polls. We're now more than 3 years into it, or around 3 years into it, on how people think the court has been changing from an ideological standpoint. What did we find this time on that question?
Yeah, as President Trump's nominations, 2 of them at least, were replacing people from the conservative wing of the court, but his last nomination, replacing liberal Justice Ginsburg with more conservative Justice Barrett, moves the court from a 5-4 to a 6-3 majority of Republican appointed justices. And as I said, Jackson won't change that since she's replacing a justice appointed by the Democrats. When we asked people how much or what direction, how has the court changed over the last 15 years, 19% say it's gotten much more conservative, 31% more conservative, 30% think it's not changed much, 17% think it's gotten somewhat more liberal, and 3% much more liberal.
And breaking that down by people's own ideological orientations.
This is where I think there's sort of striking asymmetry in the way partisans view the court. Among Republicans, 37% think the court has gotten more liberal over the last 15 years, even as we've seen the court move to a larger Republican-appointed majority. Democrats see the world the opposite way. There, 69% of Democrats think it's gotten more conservative over that time. Just 29% of Republicans think it's gotten more conservative. So I think what we're seeing here is a fairly striking example of our partisan lenses affecting how we see the court. And one of the elements there is, what do we know about the court and whether that's true or not?
And one of the things that people sometimes don't know enough about is who appointed the majority of justices.
Yeah, and this is the lack of information on to some extent. Excuse me, what we find is that again, a court that is a 6-3 Republican appointed majority, we still find 29% of Republicans who believe that the majority is appointed by a Democrat, despite Trump having 3 appointments in a row. 31% of independents believe there's a Democratic majority, and maybe most surprising, 23% of Democrats think there's a Democratic majority. So there's quite a gap in information about this. And the way we ask the question is, do you think it's definitely a majority Republican, probably a majority Republican, probably a majority Dem, and definitely a majority Democrat? There we see a bit even more of a difference. Only 22% of Republicans say that there's definitely a Republican appointed majority. 33% of Democrats know that. And so there's a little bit more accurate perception, at least on the certainty of this, among Democrats, and less so among Republicans, despite the judicial successes they've had over the 4 years of the Trump administration in particular.
And how you perceive who appointed what president, the party of the president who appointed the majority, seems to affect how you perceive the change in the court, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely. Among Republicans who believe there's a Democratic majority, just 18% say the court's gotten more conservative. But if they know it's a Republican majority, that goes all the way up to 34%. Among Democrats who believe it's a Democratic majority, 56% nevertheless say it's gotten more conservative. But if they understand it's a Republican majority, that jumps up to 74%. And the same with independents, who go from 24% more conservative if they're misperceiving the court majority, up to 59% if they have the correct information about that. So getting this information right does influence your views of the court, even within political party. And it's fairly important to have that information to understand what's going on in the court.
And the overall perception of the ideological trend of the court since 2019.
So instead of asking, how do you think it's changed over time, we also ask, how would you characterize the court now? Is it very conservative, somewhat conservative, moderate, somewhat liberal, or very liberal? And what we've seen consistently is a substantial number say moderate, but over recent years, we've seen a shift to more people saying it's conservative, either very or somewhat conservative. If we go back to 2019, when we did our national survey, 38% said the court was conservative and 50% said moderate. Now, 52% say conservative, 36% say moderate, and 12% say liberal. So there has been a shift that's, I think, fairly notable, a rise of about 14 percentage points in those who would characterize the court as conservative, and a decline of about 14% of those who would call it moderate.
And again, this is an area where your perception of who the party of the president who appointed the justices affects how you perceive the trend.
Pretty strongly. I would say that the trend to seeing it as a conservative, or a conservative court is there whether you believe Democrats still control it or whether you believe Republican appointed justices are the majority. But there is still a striking difference. Of those who believe Democratic presidents appointed the majority, 32% would currently call the court conservative. But of those who know that Republicans have appointed the majority, that jumps up to 60% who say it's a conservative court. So having the correct information about the makeup of the court clearly has a pretty substantial influence on how you perceive the court today.
Let's look at that from the standpoint of specific issues and how people perceive who's gained or lost rights in recent years in Supreme Court rulings. Let's start with LGTB people.
Yeah, and so the question was, over the last 15 years or so, do you think the court has expanded or reduced or not changed much either way the rights of various groups? So for LGTB people, 71% see the court as having expanded rights. That seems to fit pretty well with the expansion of gay rights through the court, including same-sex marriage and protections on job discrimination issues, cases that this court has decided in just recent years. Another is expanding the rights of campaign donors. Here, the court famously struck down parts of the various campaign finance laws a few years ago. 40% see an expansion of rights there. Then we get into some things where there's a lot more debate and a lot more uncertainty about what the court's done. Expanding the rights of minority voters, the protections for minority voters, 36% see the court as expanding those rights, but 25% see it as reducing those rights. And, you can imagine pointing to different cases to make this argument, but clearly there's less agreement about what the court has done on that. Another is the rights of religious people and organizations, where the court has recently expanded the rights of religious organizations to make decisions based on the beliefs of their employees, their religious beliefs, and to protect those. But here again, the opinions of the public are a little more split. 31% see expanded rights, but 23% say reduced rights, for a net of just 8% on that one. Finally, gun owners, 29% think gun rights have expanded, 28% say they've been reduced. The court is hearing a gun rights case this year, but has otherwise not been exceptionally active on this, with it being quite a while since there was a direct Second Amendment decision. And finally, the rights of those seeking an abortion, 19% say those rights have been expanded, but 49% say the court has reduced the rights to an abortion. By far the strongest view of the court reducing rights over that period. And again, considerable political argument about what the trend in court's decisions have been and may be in the coming session.
Yeah, there's going to be developments on that front by the end of June, let's expect.
Indeed.
Overall approval of how the court is doing?
In this survey, 54% approve of the job the court's doing, 45% disapprove. In 2020, September of 2020, that was 66 approve, 33 disapprove. And last July, it was 60% approve, 39 disapprove. We saw a substantial drop in September last year to a 49-50 more disapproving. And it's worked its way up a little bit from that 49 to the current 54. So a little bit of improvement over the last 6 months or so, but a substantial decline from where we were in 2019.
If you break down those answers about approval or disapproval overall of the court's performance, if you break that down by party, what do you find?
Yeah, here there's a little bit of a surprise. Republicans are more approving of the court, 64% approve. It's 51 with independents and 52 with Democrats. But that's not nearly as sharp a partisan split as we see, for example, over Judge Jackson's nomination to the court, or as we see on specific cases facing the court. It's a striking thing that as politicized as the public is generally, and as political as the court has become as an object of political debate, that the court still gets reasonably strong approval ratings across the parties. Democratic approval dropped off a good bit over the fall, but has now come back to that 52-48 split, just barely net positive among Democrats, who have certainly been, in a political sense, critical of the court over the last 6 months. So this is maybe where the court still retains a certain legitimacy across parties compared to the way we view presidents, where barely 10% of support from the opposite party would be expected of presidents or of many political issues that might split 90 to 10 across partisan grounds. Here, 64-36 split, 51-48, 52-48. Those are actually pretty good support or approval, at least, even among independents and Democrats.
And for our last set of matters here, let's look at some specific issues that are coming before the court and are likely to have some decisions again before the end of this term in June, starting with the abortion questions we were referring to before.
So we've been monitoring this for a while, of course, and the question is, would you favor a court decision that strikes down the Roe versus Wade decision, which made abortion legal in the 50 states? 32% favor that, 68% oppose striking down Roe. Those are percentages of the people who have an opinion on the issue. That's not changed much since September, when it was 28 favor, 72% oppose. We also see a pretty sharp party split on this. 68% of Republicans would like to see Roe struck down, 32% opposed. That's just 8% of Democrats that would strike it down, 92 opposed. And independents in the middle, 31% would strike it down. 69% would oppose striking it down.
Another case that is pending involves whether race can be used as one factor in college admissions.
And here we find 75% would support the court banning the use of race in admissions. 25% would like to see race continued to be used. This is in line with a lot of national polling that has shown this over a number of years, even as the court has continued to affirm affirmative action in college admissions for quite some time. But it's one where the balance of public opinion weighs against the use of race. Here, the party split is 89% of Republicans would ban the use of race, 76% of independents, and even a majority, 58% of Democrats would not allow race to be used in admissions. And among minority groups, there's support for that as well. 58% of Blacks say that they would like the court not to allow race to be used, 70% of Hispanics, and 81% of other and mixed race people. So this is a case where a long-standing court precedent allowing courts to use race in order to ensure a diverse student body is, I think, one that public opinion is fairly solidly opposed, at least when asked in the way we ask it. One should always note that issues are very complex and different question wordings can affect the kinds of answers you get.
The religious rights of business owners is a hot subject.
Yes, the court has just accepted another case in which a business owner seeks to deny services to gay people based on that business owner's religious beliefs. We asked if voters thought that religious beliefs can justify refusing service to gay people. Only 39% favored a ruling like that. 61% are opposed to it. So here's an example of continuing support for the rights of gay people as against the religious rights of business owners. This is a conflict we'll see worked out in court decision in the upcoming terms. But here, again, there's a big party split. 70% of Republicans would favor that religious protection for business owners. Only 14% of Democrats would do so. And again, among independents, 39% would protect the business owner's rights, but 61% of independents would protect the rights of gay people.
Second Amendment.
Here, there's a solid majority in favor of a ruling in a case that's pending for this term for whether the Second Amendment protects the right to carry a gun outside the home. The court previously has ruled you have a right to a gun in your home for self-defense, but has not addressed the question of carrying one outside the home. We, of course, have many states, including our own Wisconsin, that have various forms of concealed carry permits or even concealed carry without a permit now. But those are based on state laws, not federal laws. So this is a ruling that affects the Second Amendment right and would apply across all the states. 63% favor a ruling that would extend the Second Amendment to carrying a weapon outside the home. 37% opposed to that. That includes 90% of Republicans in favor and 70% of independents. But a minority, just 28% of Democrats, favor that extension of the Second Amendment.
The full results of all the questions about the Supreme Court will be on the Marquette Law School Poll website, law.marquette.edu/poll. And we will be releasing this week results of other questions from our national survey related to non-Supreme Court matters, like feelings about Joe Biden and some of the Republican potential candidates. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, great thanks to Professor Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette Law School Poll, for leading us through these results and for all his work leading the entire project. And we will be back in roughly 2 months with more results on the national polls. Thank you for listening.